Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Rohingya, and specifically those Rohingya who currently find themselves at sea right in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic, which countries around the world are dealing with as well. They've been refused entry. At least 2 boats that we know of have been refused entry into Malaysia. Bangladesh has also just said it will not allow these boats to enter into its country either. Where does this leave this Rohingya at this point in time? We know that these are long-suffering people. They are the most persecuted minority, according to the United Nations, and they have been for a while now. Just last week, we had reports of a number of Rohingya dying at sea as well from starvation and otherwise. Who will really step up at this point in time and deal with this issue as well? Certainly, every country has its own issues to deal with within its own borders of its own citizens, and how to deal with social distancing in developing countries, which have a lot of poverty as well on their own. Nevertheless, we can't all just ignore the fact that these are people at sea right now suffering, and they need to be as well respected, and their human rights need to be, of course, taken into account. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Shafiur Rahman, who is a Bangladeshi British documentary filmmaker. He's joining us now from Cambridge in the UK. He's been working on Rohingya issues since December 2016. We're also joined by Farid Khan, who is the Director of Advocacy and Media Relations at the Rohingya Human Rights Network. He's joining us now from Ottawa in Canada. Farid, good morning to you, and Shafiur Rahman, thank you for your time today as well. Let me go to you, Shafiur Rahman, with the question. What do you make of the issue of these Rohingya right now who find themselves on these boats at sea? Malaysia and Bangladesh both do not want them.
I think it's a horrendous situation. Only this week, my fixer was able to speak to some of the relatives who came off there, whose children were in the boat that was allowed to disembark. And the stories I heard were just terrible. People were thrown overboard who were weak. They're saying between 20 and 50 deaths.
Farid, what are your thoughts? We just gotten cut off with you a moment ago. What are your thoughts about these Rohingya who are at sea right now and find themselves essentially without a place to go?
Well, I think that as the world's attention is focused elsewhere on COVID-19, we can't forget about the Rohingya. They are still being persecuted. They are still fleeing Myanmar. And the fact that they are willing to risk themselves by going out to sea and using human traffickers to escape Myanmar is something that demonstrates their desperation. And whether it's Bangladesh or any of the other countries in that region, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, who also refused them asylum, they are basically violating their responsibilities under the...
All right, so let me just go to Shafiur Rahman. We do apologize for that. Shafiur Rahman, tell us, at this point in time, we'd gotten cut off with you as well. What are your thoughts about these Rohingya at sea? How will this situation be dealt with? Because they're still at sea, some boats at least. And of course, we're not talking about the Myanmar government yet and how they've not been essentially dealing with the situation. They seem to be not even in the picture at this point.
The Myanmar government have not taken any responsibility for what is happening in this situation at all. They would, of course, disown the Rohingya point blank. But my concern is for countries who could do something here. What's required here is, safe disembarkation for these people. And of course, go ahead, screen them. It's necessary. But to leave people adrift on boats, people who are starving, people who have nowhere to go, actually risks another health issue. Because if you don't have managed disembarkation, if your disembarkation is, you don't know where it's going to be, then these people could potentially create a risk. So if you want to do the right thing, if you want to do the sensible thing, you would have managed disembarkation to help these people and to screen them and to look after them. That's what you need to do.
But then, Shafiur Rahman, the argument, Bangladeshi side at least, is that they're hosting so many Rohingya already, right, in Cox's Bazar. I'm just honing in on Bangladesh because that's the country that we're talking about today. And of course, I agree with you that all the countries in the region have a responsibility in this regard. But for countries that are already hosting Rohingya, is it, do you think, unfair of us to expect that they should open their borders even more because, they're dealing with several other issues at the same time?
Well, put it this way. I mean, Bangladesh is able to rescue these people, is able to safely disembark them, is able to screen them like they've done with the Rohingya who disembarked last week. So really, it's up to them to make sure that they do this, because the alternatives are really unconscionable. The alternatives could backfire on the region. Now, Bangladesh was part of this Bali process discussions only 2 months ago. Only 2 months ago, all of these countries that we're talking about, Thailand, Malaysia, Bangladesh, Indonesia, etc., all of them were at a meeting in Sri Lanka. And they were talking about the preparedness of these irregular maritime movements. And at that meeting, they stressed the importance of non-refoulement, and they stressed the importance of dealing with irregular movements of refugees and safely dealing with that. All that's gone up the spout. All that's not happening. Suddenly, the pretext of COVID is being used and is being, that's, oh, we need to protect our borders, or we need to protect our people, and so on. The best way to protect your own people is to safely disembark the Rohingya, give them food, screen them, and really address the larger issue of how do you stop genocide in Myanmar, and how do you stop people trying to escape Myanmar.
All right, back with us, Fareed. What are your thoughts about, again, as I'd put to Shafiur Rahman, the fact that, a country like Bangladesh is already dealing with quite a few Rohingya refugees, especially those, of course, in Cox's Bazar. Is it fair for us to then expect Bangladesh to open its borders to even more Rohingya, especially, again, in the context of COVID-19?
Well, the numbers of Rohingya coming in now who are fleeing are a small trickle compared to what it was 2 years ago. So adding a few hundred people into the refugee population right now that's already in Bangladesh is not going to be a huge added burden. In addition, they have responsibilities under the Refugee Convention to not just Bangladesh, but the other countries where these refugees have tried to escape to. The other thing is you've got them on these rickety boats out in the middle of the Bay of Bengal, and people are dying. They're starving to death because they can't land anywhere. And, I mean, we're supposed to show our humanity to the suffering and the persecuted, and there's no one who has suffered more or been persecuted more than the Rohingya.
And do you think that at this point, Fareed, that there has been enough pressure put on the Myanmar government, on Aung San Suu Kyi, for example, to, again, reform their policies towards the Rohingya? Because that's obviously the root cause of all of this, and that needs to be dealt with.
Actually, no, I don't believe there has been enough pressure put on them. The nations, the ASEAN nations in the region continue to do trade. Singapore continues to be a major banking center for senior officials of the government and the military. Japan is investing in Myanmar. This is not the actions of nations that want to make Myanmar do the right thing and address the issue of the persecution of the Rohingya and to put pressure on them to stop their genocidal policies. There needs to be added pressure put on these nations in the Southeast Asian region, in the Indian Ocean Basin, who continue to do trade with Myanmar to basically pressure that government to do the right thing. We've got Myanmar currently at the ICJ, and certainly that's put some pressure on the government. But the only thing it seems that a lot of governments understand in situations like this is economics and trade and money, and I think that lever has to be used in order to make them do the right thing.
All right, so Shafiur Rahman, let's talk for a moment about, I'm going to go back to, again, Bangladesh and even Malaysia, really. These are countries which, as I said earlier as well, are dealing with their own respective issues, especially now with this COVID-19 pandemic. Do you think that all of the above have received enough support from the international community as well, right? Because that's something that had been an issue not too long ago, where Bangladesh has said, we desperately need more help from the international community to be able to host all of these Rohingya refugees. And, with all the criticism going towards the Bangladeshi government and, that island that they had chosen to host the Rohingya refugees, etc., they still need support because Bangladesh is very much a developing country. Has the world also at large acted enough?
We can attempt an answer at that by looking at the repatriation attempts that Bangladesh has tried. These have failed, and the reason that they've failed is that no humanitarian agency or rights group judge conditions in Rakhine State to be safe. And the people themselves, the Rohingya themselves, were never going to go back to Rakhine State, given their repeated forced repatriations and repeated episodes of catastrophic violence. Now, so really the international community has to address what is going on in Myanmar, has to address the ongoing genocide in Myanmar. That is the source of all these refugees. And that's what needs to be addressed. And of course, it hasn't happened. There's not been sufficient pressure applied on Myanmar at all. Things are, of course, ramping up now. There are various international mechanisms on the go, the ICC, the ICJ, and also a lawsuit in Argentina. But it isn't sufficient. What you need are international bodies and countries to make sure that Myanmar plays ball and make sure that there are consequences if they don't, including sanctions.
Fadi, let's talk for a moment about that sort of international support, right, being given to these refugees and asylum seekers. At this point in time, within this COVID-19 context, I mean, any refugee, and we can talk even in more general terms, even around the world, in places like Greece or otherwise, are probably not getting the international support that they respectively need as well. And I imagine every country is sort of thinking at this point, why should we do more for refugees versus just concentrating on our own citizens and keeping them safe and healthy? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, to ignore the refugee crisis, whether it's dealing with the Rohingya or refugees anywhere else in the world, is to basically set up the building blocks for long-term problems in the various regions of the world where refugees are concentrated. In the case of the Rohingya, you have a nation, Bangladesh, which is not economically strong, and it is hosting the largest refugee camp in the world right now. And they're doing it, obviously, with aid from the United Nations and international partners and countries. Canada committed $300 million over 3 years to the refugee situation in Bangladesh, and other nations have committed hundreds of millions of dollars as well. So there is that aspect of it, but the thing is that unless there's more pressure brought to bear by other countries, particularly countries that stand up for human rights, Canada included, unless that pressure is brought to bear on Myanmar, then there is just going to be a repetition of the sorts of long-term refugee problems that we've seen in other parts of the world over the last 20, 30, 40 years. The only way that the problem is going to be addressed is to get, as was being said, to get at the root problem, which is the genocidal policy of the Myanmar government. Both the civilian leaders and the military leaders have to be brought to justice, and there has to be economic pressure put on Myanmar, including, I would say, sanctions, so that they can feel some pain and feel the pressure to do the right thing.
All right, Shafiur Rahman, a final word before I let you both go. What do you think the coming days hold for these Rohingya at this time? Do you think one of the above countries will do the right thing? And then, again, this is not a solution, right, to this issue. We can't just have waves and waves of Rohingya, even within this situation with coronavirus spreading around the world, leaving their country to seek safety and security. This needs to be resolved at some level, but it's off the radar. So do you think this is only going to get worse?
We must remember what happened in 2015. At that time, Thailand and Malaysia took a very, very hardline approach. They reinforced their borders. They refused to allow any disembarkation. And thousands of Rohingya were basically towed out by the authorities out of their territorial waters, and they were set adrift. So we don't want a repetition of that. We want safe disembarkation, and we want to help these people, and we need these people to be treated with dignity. In terms of crisis management, look, this is a war, and it's physiological that people will leave in a place which is a battlefield, and this is what you expect. So regionally, they've got to come to an agreement about how to manage this whole situation. And that really involves pressuring Myanmar. There's no other way but the solution rests with Myanmar, and they have to be made to see that.
Very well. We'll leave it there, but we, of course, appreciate both of our guests for highlighting this very important issue, again, which is not being spoken about enough around the world. That was Shafir Rahman speaking to us here from Cambridge, and Farid Khan was speaking to us from Ottawa in Canada quite early in the morning at his end. We appreciate, of course, his time and insight. As I said, viewers, not enough people are speaking about this issue, but nevertheless, it is a crisis just waiting to happen, to have people out at sea seeking safety and security from persecution and not being allowed to dock, not being allowed by countries to enter into their territory out of fear, possibly legitimate fear of COVID-19 and the spread of that within their borders. Nevertheless, as both of our guests have said, there are mechanisms to ensure that testing happens the moment these people reach those shores, but they can't just be left out there to die, literally, as they have just in the past week or so. These are human beings again, just as human beings are stuck in refugee camps in Greece and other places around the world. These are also human beings currently out at sea. And that situation needs to be dealt with, as well as, of course, the root cause, which is the situation in Myanmar, in Rakhine State. Aung San Suu Kyi and that entire government cannot be let off go scot-free. We'll have to, of course, see how the ICJ case also works out at this time. I'll be back with my next segment after this break.